The average age of menopause in the United States is 51 years old. Now, that means that we have outliers on each side, and that the current estimates are that the majority of women will experience symptoms for an average of, say, 7 to 8 years. However, a new study that came out from the University of Virginia is calling this entire idea into question. And it also helped me understand, or I'm starting to understand, whether we're seeing symptoms earlier or if we have a change in overall health in our population. So, if you're feeling brain fogged, weight gain, mood swings, hot flashes, night sweats, you're not alone. And particularly if you're listening to this and you happen to be over 45, we would almost anticipate that the majority of women actually would be feeling those symptoms. Some of us are outliers and maybe we got heart palpitations or insomnia instead of hot flashes. However, the majority of women are experiencing something by that time. But the recent study showed that over 20% of women under the age of 46 have already consulted a doctor about perimenopausal symptoms, and many feel like they're still not getting answers. So that tells us that perimenopause is still widely misunderstood, and nearly every woman is going to be affected by some symptoms. None of us get a pass. We all do 100% on the full-on menopause experience. Nobody gets to go through that without that. However, what we're starting to see is that those symptoms, and they're oftentimes very classic menopausal symptoms, are showing up in women in their 30s, right? Mid to early 30s, and last anywhere from 5 to 10 years. But in many women, it could easily be 15 years, long before they actually see the menstrual irregularities that many people assume are part of the experience. So here's what the study showed. Hot flashes and night sweats. About 75% of women experience that because the hypothalamus, which is the thermostatic controller for the body, is controlled by estrogen. And when estrogen starts to drop, that control of the thermostat starts to go awry. Now, mood swings. Estrogen also helps modulate serotonin and dopamine, which are our major motivators and sort of happy kumbaya neurotransmitters. And then progesterone regulates and helps the receptors work better for GABA, which is our natural Xanax. And so therefore, when those start to fluctuate in perimenopause, we're going to see mood swings, and we're going to see mood stability kind of go out the window. And depending on what study you look at, it's like 3 out of 5 people get anxiety, 2 out of 4 have depression. So you've got these very high numbers of very common mood swings. Weight gain and metabolic changes, we talk about that a lot. And we also see progesterone levels declining, and we start to see insomnia and difficulty staying asleep. And then if you have hot flashes or night sweats, that makes it worse, but those are not the only cause. And probably the most scary is the brain fog and forgetfulness that women experience. And when our estrogen levels drop, that becomes hard for us to remember things like concentrating or remember why we walked into a room. Now, if we're experiencing that, that's pretty interesting. However, so let's talk a little bit about the actual study. So this study looked at 4,432 women. The age range was 30 years and older, so 30 years and older. And the goal of the study was to assess the prevalence and severity of symptoms and healthcare-seeking behavior among women experiencing perimenopause symptoms. So the consultation rate. So let's talk about how many actually went and tried to get consultations. So 20.7%, so 908 women reported consulting with a healthcare provider about perimenopause and menopause. 275 women, 30.3% of those who consulted a doctor, were actually under the age of 46, which means they were younger than the expected age range that we would see perimenopausal symptoms. When we look at the 30 to 35-year-olds, it was 4.3% had consulted a doctor. 36 to 40-year-olds, 8.0%. 41 to 45, it goes up to 16.5, which now starts to make sense. The 46 to 50 goes up to 36.2, and then the 51 to 55, where everything really comes to a head for the average woman, was 48.7. And then when you look at the women 56 years of old age or older, 51.5%. So this is a significant issue because women are basically repeatedly having to go to medical providers to get assistance because they are not getting the right assistance for their hormone balancing issues. Now, here's where it gets a little more interesting. 70.8% were told they were in perimenopause at the time of consultation. Now, your 30 to 35-year-olds, 0.8 were diagnosed with this. But that makes sense because doctors have preconceived notion of when perimenopause start, and they'll often overlook things like missed periods and or hot flashes or night sweats for something else in a younger woman. Now, 36 to 40, they saw 2.9%, 41 to 45, 8.8, and then of course 46 to 50, it was 24.8. 51 to 55, it was 42.6, and over 56 was 42.1, which makes sense. At that point, they're like, hey, by the way, your period stopped a long time ago. You've got symptoms. But what I thought was more important was that there was a significant number of younger women who were using the Flow app and actually reporting to medical providers having very similar experiences to the women that were in the much older age group that were having symptoms of perimenopause. So, what was the symptom severity? So, they used a menopause rating scale to measure the symptom severity, and they looked at psychological and what they call somatovegetative. So that's the hot flashes, the sweating, the sleep problems, and urodogenital, right? So vaginal dryness, urinary issues. So mood swings, irritability, hot flashes, night sweat, sweating, sleep issues, vaginal dryness, urinary incontinence, right? So the mean total score on a 30 to 35-year-old, so the mean total was 5.0. 36 to 40 was only 5.5. 41 to 45 was 6. And then it goes up quite a bit at the 46 to 50, which was 7.5. And then over 51, we see 10.5. Now, when we look at the percentage of women who reported severity, right? So frequency of symptoms obviously increased as the women got older, although I would say that those numbers of 36 to 40 at 5.5 only having a 0.5 difference on the average score on the median, I'm sorry, not the average, the median score does indicate that there's a lot of symptomology. But here's where it gets more interesting. The 30 to 35-year-olds that were reporting very similar symptoms, vasomotor symptoms, sleep irregularities, mood issues, genital urinary symptoms, 30 to 35-year-olds at a 55.4% reported moderate to severe symptoms. Right? So this wasn't just a little bit. These women were really experiencing symptoms that were significant enough for them to actually start to go to a physician to get help and answers. So the 36 to 40-year-olds was 53.8, had moderate to severe symptoms. 41 to 46, it goes up to 58.6. 46 to 50, it went up to 61.4. And then over 51, it's 66.2 and roughly stays about the same. I think the thing that's even more important here is most women in their 40s, mid 40s to 50s, expect to kind of go through some symptoms of menopause. But for a 30 to 35-year-old to experience those symptoms at 55%, that's pretty significant, right? Even more significant was like absence of period for 12 months or more, right? So the odds ratio of the women was 1.85, hot flashes 0.81, vaginal dryness 0.61, cycle length or irregularity. So all of a sudden they become irregular, 0.49, heart palpitations, heart palpitations, 0.45, and frequent urination. And these were the ones that they used a logistic regression to identify symptoms that were more likely or most likely to predict perimenopausal diagnosis, right? So what that means is an absence of period for over 12 months. So there was a significant portion of young women experiencing period cessation. That's meaningful because that's early for things like that to happen. And when they looked at all the women that were diagnosed with perimenopause, they were 2 to 4 times more likely to experience a major episode of depression and experience overall higher levels of anxiety, irritability, and difficulty concentrating and brain fog. Even more importantly, 50 to 60% of the women had increased sleep difficulties. So we're seeing major sleep disruption in all age groups. And and they were strongly linked to hot flashes and night sweats, but they weren't exclusive to that. However, in those younger populations, they were experiencing hot sweats, hot flashes, and night sweats. And so it's not just something that we're going to see in older population. Ladies, if you're noticing more fine lines and wrinkles, it's not just about aging, it's about the loss of estrogen. And that affects our skin structure, making it drier, thinner, less firm. But here's the great news: I've created Biased Mastery Cream to help. This luxurious bioidentical estrogen cream supports your natural hydration and elasticity. It's packed with nourishing oils like olive, jojoba, aloe, and coconut, so it feels amazing and helps soften those lines and bring back that healthy glow. I've been using it, and let me tell you, my skin has never looked or felt better. It's smoother, more radiant, and those little cracks and creases are way less noticeable. If you're ready to give your skin some extra love, check out By Est Mastery on the Metabolic Blueprint website. And that's metabolicblueprint.com/Biest Mastery. That's BIEST Mastery, MASTERY. And your face will thank you. Now, when they looked at ethnic and racial breakdown, 60.3% of the participants were white, European American, Caucasian background. 18.3 were Black and African descent. 8.3 were Hispanic, Latina, and 3.1 were Asian or Asian American. Right? So what we see is obviously it was predominantly Caucasian, which happens a lot in almost all studies. But there was a good swath that mimics the percentages of individuals across the United States in particular. But then if we were to look into other groups' distribution, um, if we look at the key takeaways from the study, over 20% of women under 46 are already actually experiencing symptoms of perimenopause, many of which are like period related. So they're experiencing a lack of a period, they're experiencing period irregularities, hot flashes, and night sweats, which are vasomotor symptoms, which indicate significant changes in hormones at that point. And this is much, much earlier than we would have anticipated seeing it. And the high rates of moderate to severe symptoms were reported even in that much younger category. Vasomotor symptoms like your hot flashes and night sweats and sleep were among the most common complaints. And that perimenopause definitely is a mental health issue. And if we look at the mental health kind of crisis that we have, particularly in the US, the hormones are playing a role on top of everything else. So what is your take-home message from this? So the take-home message is most of the women that listen to this podcast are much older, right? Sorry, you're probably my contemporaries. You're in your 50s. You're like, of course I'm in menopause. However, you might have daughters that are entering into their late 20s and early 30s. I saw one of my girlfriend's son, and he's 31. He's 31. I was like, oh my gosh, how are you 31 years old? Right? So we have children, and as women in this age group, we kind of span this huge span. We have friends that might have kids that are very young or relatively young, and then many of us are empty nesters and our kids are having kids, if not multiple kids. But we could have kids entering into their 30s that might be experiencing these symptoms that we just don't know. Now, what this does bring me to a more scientific and bigger conversation. Why are we seeing that? Is it the awareness around menstrual cycles and symptoms and being able to track it more clearly? Is it all of these pieces that now allow us to understand this, and maybe these symptoms have always been there? Or is this a greater sign of changes in fertility and women's hormones overall? I would like to argue for the latter, not the former. And here's the reason why. If we look at sperm counts for men, compared to decades ago, sperm counts are down. Sperm morphology, meaning are they shaped and configured in a way that can make penetration of the egg and fertilizing the egg positive? No, we're seeing significant changes in male sperm morphology. And so, some of the infertility world is actually male side, sperm side. It's men actually, their contribution to the DNA sets up for the placenta. So a lot of the even just the fertility issues that we see that women take the heat for, take the responsibility for, and go through the treatment for, are actually from the man's side because they have changes in their chromosomal activity, their sperm and their sperm's health. So if we take that and we look at it, we go, okay, there's something going on with men's fertility, right? Those fertility levels are definitely down. Could we be also witnessing some changes in women's fertility and particularly hormone control in younger and younger populations because our world has changed? I would like to postulate that that is something we are seeing. And I do believe it's from lots of different things. I think we have a culture and environment and world that is much more stressful. And we know, if you've listened to a lot of my podcasts recently, stress and cortisol can suppress normal hormone function, particularly sex hormones. And so we can see some suppression there. So maybe these young women are experiencing cortisol excess and suppression. And then often in these more traditional environments, no one's looking at that. So no one's helping somebody understand why their hormones may be completely off. They're just assuming it's perimenopause and sort of slapping the label on. So stress would definitely be a contributor. But I would say there's also the whole endocrine disrupting environment that we have, the chemicals we've added to our food supply and our environment, and that will continue to spill out into our environment because we're going to lift EPA regulations, and we're not going to reduce the amount of chemicals we're using in animal feeds and all those other things. We talk about it, but it's not going to happen because you can't benefit business and big industry and also regulate them at the same time to make our food safe. Those two are diametrically opposed. So the reality is our environment's pretty damn toxic, and most of those toxins are endocrine disrupting, particularly for women, and they're going to get worse, not better. And I believe that these are also disrupting our normal hormone function, receptor function, and what's happening in the body. Now, we have a much deeper dive to go here, but what this study is really showing is that perimenopause starts a lot earlier for women. And that if a woman is experiencing things even in their potentially early 30s, that could be a sign something's going on, and we shouldn't be dismissive of those symptoms. And if you happen to be an older woman and maybe you're looking back now and you're like, wait a minute, I started this stuff way earlier. You might have been in the transition for a lot longer than you thought. And which means that, hormone replacement and really taking good care of yourself is really important because the statistics show the earlier we start menopause, so the less children we have, the the later we start our cycles, the going through puberty, and the earlier we end our cycles or lose our fertility, affects our overall mortality. So for those of us that maybe thought we were having experiences then, but everybody was super dismissive because you're in your 30s and there's no way you could be in perimenopause, maybe you were, right? Maybe you were. This study would show that maybe we're missing the boat. And so the take home message from this is, don't dismiss your younger peers and friends or children that might be experiencing some of these problems because it may very well be true. And if it was true for you, this is a good place to like double down and get help if you haven't gotten help yet, and realize that maybe you've been experiencing these problems for a lot longer. All right. So thank you for listening to Menopause Mastery. If you loved this episode, please share it with a friend because together we rise. Because I love doing this and I love sharing information, and I want to help as many women as possible. Have a great, great week, and I'll see you next week.